Hello friends and welcome to tonight's edition of Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. If you enjoy these readings, I would encourage you to subscribe and click the like button so that you will be notified when a new bedtime story is ready for you. And now, it is time to unwind. Find a place where you can relax. Once you have settled into this place, take a deep breath. Your day is done. There is nothing left for you to worry about. All you have to do is listen to the stories and fall asleep. And so, we begin. Possessing Prudence by Amy Wentworth Stone. A lies, an abomination unto the Lord 124. A lies, an abomination unto the Lord 125. A lies, an abomination unto the Lord 126. Recited Prudence Jane and paused. Go on, said Aunt Annie, looking up from her sewing, and fixed her eyes severely on the small blue back across the room. Prudence Jane, with the heels of her little ankle ties together, and her hands clasped tightly behind her, was standing in the corner, saying what was known in the family as her punish sentence. Whenever she had been unusually naughty, she had to say one 400 times, up in Aunt Annie's room. It was no doubt a silly sort of punishment, but it was one that Prudence Jane strongly objected to. And that, after all, is the essence of a punishment. Prudence Jane had 7 teasing, mimicking brothers, and whenever one of them caught her saying a punish sentence, it was days before she heard the last of it. Already in the garden below there was audible a shrill voice singing, "A lie is an abomination unto the Lord," to the tune of "Has anybody here seen Kelly?" And out of the corner of her eye, which was supposed to be fastened on the rosebuds of Aunt Annie's wallpaper, Prudence Jane could see an impudent little person in corduroys, straddling the gravel walk and squinting up at the window. "Is a lies an abomination in the Bible?" inquired Prudence Jane. "Yes," said Aunt Annie. "Go on." "Where?" demanded Prudence Jane. "Where?" repeated Aunt Annie a little blankly. Why, in the middle of the Bible. Don't you listen to the minister, Prudence Jane?" "The middle of the minister's Bible," pursued Prudence Jane. "Yes, of course," said Aunt Annie. "Prudence Jane, if you don't go on at once, I shall have you say it 500 times. A lie is an abomination unto the Lord 127, resumed Prudence Jane hastily. Prudence Jane's sentences varied from day to day, it being Aunt Annie's idea to fit the sentence to the crime whenever possible. Thus, for being late to school, it was, naturally, procrastination is the thief of time, while for telling Lena, the cook, that Uncle Arthur had said she was more of a lady than Aunt Annie, the sentence had been nothing less than, "Truth crushed to earth will rise again." This particular fib had been very disastrous in its consequences. We will not dwell upon them here. They make a story in themselves. Suffice it to say that there was no possible excuse for Prudence Jane. It was otherwise with the fib for which she was this morning serving a sentence up in Aunt Annie's room. Those who also have been named after their 2 grandmothers will at once forgive Prudence Jane for telling the new minister the very first time she met him, that her name was Imogen Rose. It was, to be sure, a stupid little fib, and was therefore quite unworthy of Prudence Jane. For Prudence Jane almost never told stupid little fibs. The fibs of Prudence Jane were little masterpieces, with a finish and distinction all their own. Her brother Will, who adored her and had a large mind, declared when he came home from college that she was the greatest mistress of imaginative fiction since George Eliot. Her Aunt Annie, who had not had the advantages of a college course, and who roomed with Prudence Jane, said that she was a simple little liar. Now this was unfair of Aunt Annie, for whatever else Prudence Jane might be, she was not simple. Even her looks belied her, with her big confiding eyes, as round and blue as two forget-me-nots, and her pale yellow hair held demurely back from her forehead by a blue ribbon fillet. She gave an impression of gentle innocence that was altogether misleading. "She is so like little Bertie," dear old Grandma Piper would say. That same frail, flower-like look that he had toward the last. I almost tremble sometimes. Haven't you noticed a transparency about her lately, Annie? But Aunt Annie never had. It may be said in passing that there was only one person to whom Prudence Jane was really transparent, and that was her youngest brother, Peter. Peter was a square, solid little person, with a vacant countenance, but nothing important that Prudence Jane did escaped him. "Just to look into that sweet little face is enough for me," Grandma Goodwin would declare. "I don't want anybody to tell me that Prudence Jane is untruthful. No child could look straight at you out of her little soul, as she always does, and tell a fib. The trouble is, they don't understand her at home. I've always said Annie Piper had a suspicious nature." To do Aunt Annie justice, it should be said that rooming with Prudence Jane did not tend to cultivate in one a nature that was trustful and confiding. And yet, at heart, Prudence Jane was really not at all the incorrigible little fibber that she seemed. She told fibs, not because she wished to deceive, but because the dull facts of life were so much less interesting than the lively little romances which she could make up out of her own head. When one is a creative genius, one naturally rebels at being shackled to anything so tedious as a fact. Prudence Jane, looking back over a day, could rarely separate the things which had really happened from those she had invented. Her brother Horace, who was studying law, said that he would give $100 to see Prudence Jane on the witness stand. This was one night at supper when she was being cross-examined by Aunt Annie. 4 or 5 minutes she had kept the family spellbound by a circumstantial account of how that afternoon she had seen an automobile truck loaded with 1,000 boxes of eggs go over the embankment. With eggs at 65 cents a dozen, this was really a very shocking tale. "Prudence Jane," said Aunt Annie, who had private sources of information, "you know well enough that no truck went over the embankment. Whatever do you mean by telling such an outrageous fib?" Prudence Jane looked across the supper table at her aunt, out of 2 round, candid eyes. "That wasn't a fib. That was just a story," she explained. "Well, it wasn't true, and stories that aren't true are very wicked," said Aunt Annie with decision. "Are all the stories in books true?" inquired Prudence Jane. the picture of innocence behind her bowl of bread and milk. No, Aunt Annie was forced to admit, but stories written in books are different. The writers don't mean for us to believe them. Do they say so in the books? Went on Prudence Jane relentlessly. Of course not, said Aunt Annie. We know their stories aren't true, so they don't deceive us. But you always know my stories aren't true too, objected Prudence Jane. So I don't deceive you either. Prudence Jane, said Aunt Annie, I shan't argue with you. You are a very naughty little girl. I sometimes think that you don't belong to us at all. You're so different from your brothers. This was true. All the other little pipers had been simple, virtuous children, with imaginations under perfect control. A remarkable family, everybody had said, until the pipers became quite complacent about themselves. This was why Prudence Jane seemed like such a judgment upon them. They had waited long and patiently, as Aunt Annie put it, for Providence to see fit to send them a dear little girl, to inherit her grandmother's names. And they received Prudence Jane. Had she appeared at an earlier date, or had there been another girl in the family, she might have escaped either the Prudence or the Jane. But for 15 years, little masculine pipers had arrived in the household with unbroken regularity, and been named, one by one, after all the available grandfathers and uncles. For the last one, indeed, there had not been even a cousin left, and he had been christened by common consent Peter Piper. And still the grandmothers waited. From the moment, therefore, when bluff old Dr. Jones looked in upon a parlor full of aunts, and announced that it was a girl at last, by Jove, there had been no choice left for Prudence Jane. The only point discussed in the solemn family conclave was as to whether she should not be Jane Prudence. Oh, for mercy's sake, call the poor little kid Jurisprudence, and be done with it, said a flippant uncle. And that had settled it. Prudence Jane was duly entered at the end of the list in the middle of the family Bible, and her career began. Through 8 years she was just unmitigated Prudence Jane. Not a syllable of it could ever be omitted, lest one grandmother or the other be slighted. And then suddenly, one day, she decided that it was a combination no longer to be borne. She hated her name with all her little soul. Therefore she would discard it and take another. This sounded simple, but there were, in fact, several complications. The most important was Aunt Annie. Never a really progressive spirit in this matter of names, Aunt Annie showed herself to be an out-and-out stand-patter. You wish that you had been called Gwendolen, she echoed in horror, as she combed out the pale yellow hair at bedtime. Why, Prudence Jane, I'm ashamed of you. Gwendolen is a very silly name indeed, and you have 2 such noble ones. I only hope that you will grow up to be like the beautiful grandmammas who gave them to you. Which was truly a lovely little bit of optimism on Aunt Annie's part. Prudence did not consult Aunt Annie further. That very night, however, staring up into the darkness from her little white bed, she decided upon a new combination. And when the Reverend Mr. Sanders came up to her the next day after Sunday school, and inquired kindly what little girl this was, Prudence Jane was quite prepared to tell him, with the transparent look which so frightened dear old Grandma Piper, that it was Imogen Rose. She fully meant to inform her family of this interesting change as soon as she got home from Sunday school. But when she tiptoed into the parlor, Aunt Annie, in all the majesty of her plum-colored satin, was sitting in a straight-backed chair, reading the Christian Word and Work, and looked unreceptive to new ideas. So Prudence Jane tiptoed out again to await a more favorable moment. Unfortunately, before that moment arrived, she had a falling out with her brother Peter. This was a mistake, for it was the part of Prudence always to make an ally of Peter Piper. He had discovered Prudence Jane flat on the floor in a corner of the library, scratching her name out of the family Bible with an ink eraser. "Did the minister tell you to write Imogen in?" he inquired blandly, as he stood in the doorway with his hands in his corduroys. "None of your business," retorted Prudence Jane, closing the Bible with a bang and sitting down upon it. And the result was that Peter Piper, from whom nothing was ever hidden, went off and told Aunt Annie all about Imogen Rose and the minister. Whereupon Aunt Annie, with her usual limited point of view, had pronounced it a very monstrous fib indeed, and had sent Prudence Jane instantly into the corner. "A lie is an abomination unto the Lord, 398. A lie is an abomination unto the Lord, 399. A lie is an abomination unto the Lord, 400. Finished Prudence Jane at a canter, and whisked around from her corner. Aunt Annie beckoned with solemn finger. "Tomorrow, Prudence Jane," she said, looking across the sewing table, "I'm going to take you to see the minister, and you must tell him yourself what your real name is, and what a dreadful story you have told him. I shall ask him what he thinks should be done with a little girl who cannot speak the truth. I'm sure I don't know what he will say, but we can't deceive a minister. They always know when they hear a fib." "Do they?" asked Prudence Jane, openly interested. Her round eyes fastened upon her aunt. "Always," replied Aunt Annie rashly. "Then why do I have to go and tell him?" asked Prudence Jane. "Prudence Jane," said Aunt Annie, "you are a very saucy little girl, and I am sure I don't know what is going to become of you." Prudence Jane walked slowly out of the room. She was considering what Aunt Annie had said about ministers, and she wondered if it were true. As she went tripping down the stairs, she decided to put the Reverend Mr. Sanders to a test the very next time she met him. And that was why it was so surprising, when she peeked through the hall window at the foot of the stairs, to behold him diligently wiping his feet on the doormat. "How do you do?" said Prudence Jane politely, as she opened the door. "Why, good afternoon, Imogen," said the minister, shaking hands cordially. Prudence Jane made the little nicks that she had learned at German school. It was always the finishing touch to Prudence Jane. The Reverend Mr. Sanders looked down upon it with a most friendly smile. "Is your aunt at home?" he asked, placing his hat on the table and following Prudence Jane into the parlor. "Yes," she said with simple candor. A fib of that sort was quite beneath Prudence Jane. Then she sat down on a velvet sofa, spread out her little blue skirt, folded her hands in her lap, and crossed her ankle ties. She had never in her life looked so much like little Bertie. The Reverend Mr. Sanders, regarding her from an opposite chair, waited for her to open her lips and say, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth." Instead, this is what she said. "Is Eliza an abomination your grandmother?" "I beg pardon," said the Reverend Mr. Sanders. "Is she dead and gone to heaven, and that's why you say, 'Unto the Lord'?" continued Prudence Jane. "I wonder, Imogen," he said, "if you would mind beginning over again." "I say, is Eliza an abomination? Your grandmother," repeated Prudence Jane. "Aunt Annie says she's written down in the middle of your Bible, where all people's relations are, and she sounded like a grandmother. They always have such horrid names." The minister looked across at the velvet sofa with eyes that entirely contradicted the gravity of his face. "No," he said, "I'm sorry, but she isn't. I wish she were. I never heard of such a jolly grandmother." "Is she an aunt?" pursued his small interlocutor. "I'm afraid that she's not even related by marriage," he replied. "Isn't she written down in the middle of your Bible at all?" said Prudence Jane. The minister shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm afraid not." "Then Aunt Annie told a whopper," announced Prudence Jane with satisfaction. "We should not malign the absent," said the Reverend Mr. Sanders. "And that being the case, suppose you go up at this point, Imogen, and tell your Aunt Annie that I am here." Prudence Jane wondered what maligning the absent was. She distrusted gentlemen who made cryptic remarks of this sort. It was a way her brother Horace had. She saw that the moment had now arrived to test Aunt Annie's theory about ministers and fibs. "She can't come down," she replied. "Can't come down?" replied the minister. "No," said Prudence Jane, looking at him out of the depths of her forget-me-not eyes. "She washed her hair." "Oh," said the Reverend Mr. Sanders, in the tone of one who finds the conversation getting definitely beyond him. At this moment an apparition with a round face and a pair of corduroy shoulders suddenly darkened the open window. "A lie is an abomination unto the Lord," it sang, and catching sight of the clerical back, vanished hastily. "Interesting chorus," observed the Reverend Mr. Sanders. Prudence Jane paid no heed to this interruption. "It's hanging down her back now," she pursued, launching upon the details with her usual aplomb. "It comes clear down to here," and standing up, she indicated a point halfway between her ankle ties and the bottom of her ridiculous skirt. The minister gazed fascinated. Prudence Jane sat down again. "She washed it with Packer's tar soap," she said, her eyes fixed upon her victim. She was quite unable to make out whether Aunt Annie was right about ministers or not. The Reverend Mr. Sanders looked like the Sphinx. "She gave a piece to a gentleman once," went on Prudence Jane, warming to her work. "He wasn't a very nice gentleman. He was a... She hesitated a moment over a fitting climax. "Episcopalian," she finished. "Mercy," said the Reverend Mr. Sanders, finding his voice at last. "And what, may I ask, are you?" Prudence Jane looked faintly surprised. "I," she said, with pride and composure, "am an Orthodox Congregationist." "Yes," said the Reverend Mr. Sanders, "so I suspected from the first." And now, what did he mean by that? Thought Prudence Jane to herself. She could no longer see his face. He had turned abruptly in his chair, and was watching something through the aperture in the portieres. Prudence Jane heard the thump of a pair of shoes plodding up the stairs and along the upper hall. She knew that it was Peter Piper going to find Aunt Annie. There was a stir in the room overhead, then the muffled sound of a rocking chair suddenly abandoned, followed by the swish of skirts. coming along the passage and down the stairs. Prudence Jane sat with parted lips on the edge of the sofa. The Reverend Mr. Sanders looked decidedly nervous, but he rose and presented a bold front to whatever might be coming to him through those portieres. In another moment they were pushed hastily aside, and Aunt Annie, crowded with a quite faultless coiffure, hurried into the room. "Why, Mr. Sanders," she said, "I did not know until this minute that you were here." Then her eye fell upon her niece. Prudence Jane was now standing in front of the sofa, tracing the pattern of the carpet with the toe of an ankle tie. "Why didn't you tell me that Mr. Sanders was waiting?" demanded Aunt Annie sternly. Prudence Jane continued to gaze at the carpet. "Mr. Sanders," said Aunt Annie, who never postponed a disagreeable duty, "we have a little girl here who cannot speak the truth, and we are going to ask you to tell us what becomes of people who tell wrong stories." The Reverend Mr. Sanders looked ill at ease. "Come here," continued Aunt Annie, holding out her hand toward the velvet sofa. Prudence Jane moved reluctantly across the room. "And now," went on the voice of the accuser, "she has even deceived her minister, and she has come to make her little confession. Tell Mr. Sanders," directed Aunt Annie, "the truth about that wicked fib." "Which one?" inquired Prudence Jane meekly. "You know very well which," answered her exasperated aunt. "The last one." Prudence Jane lifted her blue eyes from the carpet and looked straight at the unfortunate Mr. Sanders. "She didn't give any of it to the Episcopalian," she said. And then she turned and walked discreetly through the portieres. She felt that it was no moment to stay and learn what became of little girls who told whoppers. "Didn't give who what?" she could hear Aunt Annie saying vaguely on the other side of the curtains. But Prudence Jane decided to let her minister explain. The Spirit of the Herd by Dallas Lore Sharp. We were trailing the riders of P Ranch across the plains to a hollow in the hills called the Troughs, where they were to round up a lot of cattle for branding. On the way we fell in behind a bunch of some 50 cows and yearlings which one of the riders had picked up, and while he dashed off across the desert for a stray, we tenderfeet drove on the herd. It was hot, and the cattle lagged, so we urged them on. All at once I noticed that the whole herd was moving with a swinging, warping gait, with switching tails, and heads thrown around from side to side, as if every steer were watching us. We were not near enough to see their eyes. But the rider, far across the desert, saw the movement and came cutting through the sage, shouting and waving his arms to stop us. We had pushed the driving too hard. Mutiny was spreading among the cattle, already manifest in a sullen, ugly temper that would have brought the herd charging us in another minute, had not the cowboy galloped in between us as he did. So untamed, unafraid, and instinctively savage is the spirit of the herd. It is this herd spirit that the cowboy, on his long cross-desert drives to the railroad, most fears. The herd is like a crowd, easily led, easily excited, easily stampeded. When it becomes a mob of frenzied beasts, past all control, the spirit of the city gang at riot in the plains. If one would know how thin is the coat of domestication, worn by the tamest of animals. Let him ride with the cattle across the rimrock country of southeastern Oregon. No better chance to study the spirit of the herd could possibly be had. And in contrast to the cattle, how intelligent, controlled, almost human, seems the plainsman's horse. I share all the tenderfoot's admiration for the cowboy on his pony. Both of them are necessary in bringing 4,000 cattle through from P Ranch to Winnemucca. And of both is required a degree of daring and endurance, as well as knowledge of the wild animal mind, which lifts their hard work into the heroic, and makes of every drive a sagebrush epic. So wonderful is the working together of man and horse, a kind of centaur of the plains. From P Ranch to Winnemucca is a 17-day drive, through a desert of rimrock and greasewood and sage, which, under the most favorable conditions, is beset with difficulty, but which, in the dry season, and with anything like 4,000 cattle, becomes an unbroken hazard. More than all else on such a drive is feared the wild herd spirit, the quick black temper which, by one sign or another, ever threatens to break the spell of the rider's power, and sweep the maddened or terrorized herd to destruction. The handling of the herd to keep this spirit sleeping is ofttimes a thrilling experience. Some time before the visit to P Ranch, in the summer of 1912, the riders had taken out a herd of 4,000 steers on what proved to be one of the most difficult drives ever made to Winnemucca. For the first 2 days on the trail, the cattle were strange to each other, having been gathered from widely separated grazing grounds, from Double O and the home ranch, and were somewhat clannish and restive under the driving. At the beginning of the 3rd day, signs of real trouble appeared. The shortage of water and the hot weather together began to tell on the temper of the herd. The 3rd day was long and exceedingly hot. The line started forward at dawn, and all day kept moving, with the sun cooking the bitter smell of sage into the air, and with 16,000 hoofs kicking up a still bitterer smother of alkali dust, which inflamed eyes and nostrils and coated the very lungs of the cattle. The fierce desert thirst was upon the herd long before it reached the creek, where it was to bed for the night. The heat and the dust had made slow work of the driving, and it was already late when they reached the creek, only to find it dry. This was bad. The men were tired, but the cattle were thirsty, and Wade, the boss of the buckaroos, pushed the herd on toward the next rimrock, hoping to get down to the plain below before the end of the slow desert twilight. Anything for the night but a dry camp. They had hardly started on, when the whole flank of the herd, suddenly breaking away as if by pre-arrangement, tore off through the brush. The horses were as tired as the men, and, before the chase was over, the twilight was grey in the sage, making it necessary to halt at once and camp where they were. They would have to go without water. The runaways were brought up, and the herd closed in till it formed a circle nearly a mile around. This was as close as it could be drawn, for the cattle would not bed, lie down. They wanted water more than they wanted rest. Their eyes were red, their tongues raspy with thirst. The situation was a difficult one. But camp was made. 2 of the riders were sent back along the trail to bring up the drags, while Wade, with his other men, circled the uneasy cattle, closing them in, quieting them, and doing everything possible to make them bed. They were thirsty, and instead of bedding, the herd began to growl, a distant mutter of throats, low, rumbling, ominous, as when faint thunder rolls behind the hills. Every plainsman fears the growl, for it too often is a prelude to the milling, as it proved to be now, when the whole vast herd began to stir, slowly, singly at first and without direction, till at length it moved together, round and round, a great compact circle. The multitude of clicking hoofs, of clashing horns and chafing sides, like the sound of rushing rain across a field of corn. Nothing could be worse for the cattle. The cooler twilight was falling, but mingling with it, rose and thickened and spread the choking dust from their feet, which soon covered them, and shut from sight all but the wall of the herd. Slowly, evenly, swung the wall round and round without a break. Only one who has watched the milling herd can know its suppressed excitement. To keep that excitement in check was the problem of Wade and his men, and the night had not yet begun. When the riders had brought in the drags and the chuck wagon had lumbered up with supper, Wade set the first watch. Along with the wagon had come the fresh horses. Among them Peroxide Jim, a supple, powerful, clean-limbed buckskin that had, I think, as fine and intelligent an animal face as any creature I ever saw. And why should he not have been saved fresh for just such a need as this? Are there not superior horses as well as superior men? A Peroxide Jim to complement a Wade. The horse plainly understood the situation, Wade told me. And though there was nothing like sentiment for horseflesh about the boss of the P-Ranch riders, his faith in Peroxide Jim was absolute. The other night horses were saddled and tied to the wheels of the wagon. It was Wade's custom to take his turn with the second watch. But shifting his saddle to Peroxide Jim, he rode out with the four of the first watch, who, evenly spaced, were quietly circling the herd. The night, for this part of the high desert, was unusually warm. It was close, still, and without a sky. The near, thick darkness blotted out the stars. There is usually a breeze at night over these highest rimrock plains, which, no matter how hot the day may have been, crowds the cattle together for warmth. Tonight, not a breath stirred the sage, as Wade wound in and out among the bushes. The hot dust stinging his eyes and caking rough on his skin. Round and round moved the weaving, shifting forms, out of the dark and into the dark, a grey spectral line like a procession of ghosts, or some Morris dance of the desert's sheeted dead. But it was not a line, it was a sea of forms, not a procession, but the even surging of a maelstrom of hoofs a mile around. Wade galloped out on the plain for a breath of air and looked at the sky. A quick cold rain would quiet them, but there was not a feel of rain in the darkness, no smell of it on the air. Only the powdery taste of bitter sage. The desert, where the herd was camped, was one of the highest of a series of tablelands or benches. It lay as level as a floor, rimmed by a sheer wall of rock from which there was a drop to the bench of sage below. The herd had been headed for a pass, and was now halted within a mile of the rimrock on the east. where there was a perpendicular fall of about 300 feet. It was the last place an experienced plainsman would have chosen for a camp. And every time Wade circled the herd and came in between the cattle and the rim, he felt the nearness of the precipice. The darkness helped to bring it near. The height of his horse brought it near. He seemed to look down from his saddle over it, into its dark depths. The herd, in its milling, was surely warping slowly in the direction of the rim. But this was all fancy, the trick of the dark and of nerves. If a plainsman has nerves. At 12 o'clock, the first guard came in and woke the second watch. Wade had been in the saddle since dawn, but this was his regular watch. More than that, his trained ear had timed the milling hoofs. The movement of the herd had quickened, if now he could keep them going and could prevent their taking any sudden fright. They must not stop until they stopped from utter weariness. Safety lay in their continued motion. So the fresh riders flanked them closely, paced them, and urged them quietly on. They must be kept milling, and they must be kept from fright. In the taut silence of the stirless desert night, with the tension of the herd at the snapping point, any quick, unwanted sight or sound would stampede them. The sneezing of a horse, the flare of a match, would be enough to send the whole 4,000 headlong, blind, frenzied, trampling, till spent and scattered over the plain. And so, as he rode, Wade began to sing. The rider ahead of him took up the air and passed it on until, above the stepping stir of the hoofs, rose the faint voices of the men. And all the herd was bound about by the slow plaintive measures of some old song. It was not to soothe their savage breasts that the riders sang to the cattle, but to prevent the shock of their hearing any loud and sudden noise. So they sang and rode, and the night wore on to 1 o'clock, when Wade, coming up on the rim rock side, felt a cool breeze fan his face, and caught the breath of fresh, moist wind with the taste of water in it. He checked his horse instantly, listening as the wind swept past him over the cattle. But they must already have smelt it, for they had ceased their milling. The whole herd stood motionless, the indistinct forms close to him in the dark, showing their bald faces lifted to drink the sweet wet breath that came over the rim. Then they started again, but faster, and with a rumbling from their hoarse throats that tightened Wade's grip on the reins. The sound seemed to come out of the earth, a low, rumbling mumble, as dark as the night and as wide as the plain, a thick, inarticulate bellow that stood every rider stiff in his stirrups. The breeze caught the dust and carried it back from the grey-coated, ghostly shapes, and Wade saw that the animals were still moving in a circle, if he could keep them going. He touched his horse to ride on with them, when across the black sky flashed a vivid streak of lightning. There was a snort from the steers, a quick clap of horns and hoofs from far within the herd, a tremor of the plain, a roar, a surging mass, and Wade was riding the flank of a wild stampede. Before him, behind him, beside him, pressing hard upon his horse, galloped the frenzied steers, and beyond them a multitude borne on and bearing him on by the heave of the galloping herd. Wade was riding for his life. He knew it. His horse knew it. He was riding to turn the herd too, back from the rim, as the horse also knew. The cattle were after water, waterman, ready to go over the precipice to get it, carrying horse and rider with them. Wade was the only rider between the herd and the rim. It was black as death. He could see nothing in the sage, could scarcely discern the pounding, panting shadows at his side. But he knew by the swish of the brush and the plunging of the horse that the ground was growing stonier, that they were nearing the rocks. To outrun the stampede was his only chance. If he could come up with the leaders, he might yet head them off upon the plain and save the herd. There were cattle still ahead of him. How many, what part of the herd, he could not tell. But the horse knew. The reins hung on his straight neck, while Wade, yelling and firing into the air, gave him the race to win, to lose. Suddenly they veered and went high in the air, as a steer plunged headlong into a draw, almost beneath their feet. They cleared the narrow ravine, landed on bare rock, and reeled on. They were riding the rim. Close to their left bore down the flank of the herd, and on their right, under their very feet, was a precipice, so close that they felt its blackness, its 300 feet of fall. A piercing, half-human bawl of terror told where a steer had been crowded over. Would the next leap carry them after him? Then Wade found himself racing neck and neck with a big white steer, which the horse, with marvelous instinct, seemed to pick from a bunch, and to cling to, forcing him gradually ahead, till, cutting him free from the bunch entirely, he bore him off into the sage. The group coming on behind followed its leader, and in, after them, swung others. The tide was turning. Within a short time the whole herd had veered, and, bearing off from the cliffs, was pounding over the open plains. Whose race was it? Peroxide Jim's, according to Wade. For, not by word or by touch of hand or knee had he been directed in the run. From the flash of the lightning the horse had taken the bit, and covered an indescribably perilous path at top speed, had outrun the herd and turned it from the edge of the rim rock, without a false step or a tremor. Bred on the desert, broken at the roundup, trained to think steer as his rider thinks it, the horse knew as swiftly, as clearly as his rider, the work before him. But that he kept himself from fright, that none of the wild herd madness passed into him, is a thing for wonder. He was as thirsty as any animal of the herd. He knew his own peril, I believe, as none of the herd had ever known anything. And yet such coolness, courage, wisdom, and power. Was it training? Was it more intimate association with the man on his back, and so a further remove from the wild thing which domestication does not seem to touch? Or was it all suggestion, the superior intelligence above riding, not the flesh, but the spirit?